Welcome back. Today we start a series of talks on the ancient roots of recent neuroscience research dating all the way back 2,500 years, namely to a person who walked the earth in northern India named Gautama. We know him as the Buddha, and he made some astonishing claims after he was enlightened. Enlightenment meaning he had looked through the delusions that were imposed upon him on his own brain. He had looked through the mechanisms and the deep psychology of humans and their limitations. And after he had done so, he came up with a spectacular set of predictions that can actually be now tested in the laboratory. My feeling is if the Buddha was born today, he would join a neuroscience lab and apply his notion of enlightenment to brain science directly. So looking at the first slide here, we have a quote from an ancient text, the so-called Dhammapada, one of the earliest Buddhist texts. Now, Buddhism has a long history, and there are many textual sources, only some of which are probably directly related to the pronouncements of the Buddha about 500 BC. These are collected in what's called the Pali Canon. Pali being a language which was spoken in northern India, and it's likely that the Buddha has spoken a language like Pali, or perhaps even Pali itself in some form. Of course, the language has also been codified in what we now call Sanskrit, which is the original, official written language of northern India at that time. Okay, so then the Dhammapada begins with some stunning lines. It says, mind is the forerunner of all conditions. Mind is chief, and everything else that follows is created and made by the mind. Now, this day and age, we might substitute mind-brain or even brain for the word mind in the Dhammapada. But nevertheless, it's an amazing claim because it sets aside all kinds of philosophical speculations, all kinds of transcendental ideas about a Brahman, a universal world soul, all kinds of religious ideas. All this is taken out of the equation by postulating the primacy and center stage for the human mind. That is where everything takes place, and that's where everything turns. Now, in the next slide, we have a quote here that the simple but not necessarily easy step of standing back and mindfully attending to one's experience rather than being uncritically overwhelmed with the imperatives of habitual thought and emotion, one can allow a glimpse of the inner freedom not to react to what one's mind is insisting that one do. So this is part of the original prescription of the Buddha, part of the Eightfold Path, of which mindfulness or right mindfulness is a critical component. And mindfulness, as you know, is now a big buzzword in the United States. When Buddhism came to our country, to the West, it came in the form of mindfulness and certain forms of meditation. Originally introduced here by a gang of folks that were either college dropouts or took some time off college, mostly from the East Coast, Boston and New York, mostly young Jewish men who went in search of enlightenment or something different than they found here in the United States. And after a while, sometimes being ordained as monks, they came back to this country. We know them as Stephen Batchelor, Jack Kornfield, Kabat-Zinn, and many more who have gone this route. and they have brought back the idea of mindfulness. So perhaps the penetration of mindfulness into the healthcare system might be a Buddhist Trojan horse. For once mindfulness has been implanted into the mind-brain of a sympathetic host, dharmic memes are able to spread virally, rapidly and unpredictably. This is a quote from Stephen Batchelor, who wrote a book called Secular Buddhism, Imagining the Dharma in an Uncertain World. Stephen Batchelor also was an ordained monk for quite some time in Tibet. He then went to Korea to study Chan or Zen Buddhism. And when he was all done with that, perhaps spending in excess of 10 years doing these things, he returned to the United States and had an idea. And the idea was that there was too much religious overlay in Buddhism, and that these overlays probably represented accretions that were superimposed as the years went by onto the original pure message of Gautama or the Buddha. And he has then begun a number of textual interpretations to strip these accretions from the original message, resulting in a number of books. And this is a more recent one here. So his idea is to re-examine some of the Pali Canon pronouncements attributed to the Buddha and boil them down, remove religious overlays that may have been added later in order to make Buddhism more competitive with other northern Indian religions such as the Brahmanism or Hinduism. So this is then a quote, and these two quotes combined say something about the power of Buddha's idea to adjust themselves to new cultural and ethnic circumstances. So we could also imagine that instead of coming to an end somehow, that Buddhism is just at the beginning. Instead of the waning power of the orthodoxies that have held sway for the past 2,000 years, the secularization may indeed mark the collapse of what Batchelor calls Buddhism 1.0, and it might herald the birth of what he calls Buddhism 2.0. So this is the larger context in which we will present some findings in neuroscience that hark back all the way to original ideas by the Buddha. So in one of the early sutras, which are the lectures or dialogues of the Buddha, the one called Satipatthana Sutta in the Pali language, makes reference to the foundations of mindfulness. So all the meditation techniques, the ideas about mindfulness, date back to this Satipatthana Sutta, 2,500 years ago. And here's a direct quote. The Buddha is addressing his monks, and he says, "What are the four foundations of mindfulness?" And he says, "Here, bhikkhus." Bhikkhus is a term for monks. "In regard to the body, a bhikkhu abides contemplating the body, ardent, clearly knowing, and mindful, free from desires and discontent in regard to the world." If you break this down, what it means is you apply intensive concentration. You don't worry about what's going on in the world. You loosen the connection for the time that you investigate your own mind, and you give it a great deal of effort, and you achieve, or you try to achieve, a great deal of clarity as to the goings on in your own mind. And then he goes on, he also abides to the mind and the body, analyzing the different sensations that arise in the body to clearly know, to ardently perceive and analyze, and eventually contemplating the Dharma, namely his teachings, his pronouncements as to how the mind really works. So these are the foundations of mindfulness. Very much a blueprint to developing a meditative technique, especially the beginning, contemplating the body, ardent, clearly knowing, and mindful. Most meditation classes begin with the breath, following the breath, and dismissing the chatter of thoughts that tend to arise as soon as you try to do this, and redirecting your attention back to the breath. In other words, following the Buddha's advice, clearly knowing and ardently focusing on these physical sensations, and the technique as opening the method wider and not focusing just on the breath, but using a procedure called choiceless awareness. This would be the contemplating the mind part that the Buddha proposes here. So he already presages all the techniques that we are using today in mindfulness training. Now, when the explorers from the East Coast mostly returned from India and other East Asian countries, they started to implement some of these ideas, and the key figure is Jon Kabat-Zinn, who was a microbiologist at Boston, who used mindfulness-based stress reduction. He went to physicians in the Boston area and said, give me your sickest patients, treatment failures, patients with chronic pain that you don't know what to do for anymore. And he enrolled them in a structured program which used paying mindful attention to the various symptoms in the body as the Buddha had suggested, and he found that this was a very effective way of decreasing the perception of pain and making patients feel better. So this was in 1982. This was when the earliest stirrings of publications began on mindfulness in the medical field. And you can see what happened next. Slowly over the ensuing years, the rate of publication increased in an exponential fashion. Now perhaps 400 or 500 papers per month are being published that in some way involve mindfulness techniques. So mindfulness clearly has arrived. But the Buddha made another prediction. He said that if we attend to suffering, if we attend to pain or to unhappiness and clearly see it and don't run away from it, we have the chance to alleviate the suffering. There is a wall goes up, an isolation between the immediate perception of suffering and what is going on in your mind. And so this idea is being utilized in the paper that we will analyze today. But first, look at the explosion of mindfulness-based stress reduction programs in the world. You can see, of course, in the US, we have a total saturation of these programs, and Europe is not far behind. And we see some programs popping up in Asia as well, Australia as well as New Zealand. So it's probably here to stay. And what we will do in these lectures is to trace back the original source of these ideas and see what kind of Buddhism would emerge if we boil it down to ideas that can be tested clinically and in the lab. So here was a paper that came out in Lancet, probably the leading medical journal in Great Britain, in 2015. So this is a trial comparing the effectiveness and cost effectiveness of mindfulness-based cognitive therapy compared with maintenance antidepressant treatment in the prevention of relapse to another depressive episode. And it's very interesting how the result is phrased, namely, no evidence was found that mindfulness-based stress reduction was better than maintenance pharmacological therapy, implying that it also wasn't any worse. So in other words, mindfulness-based techniques were as effective as the best that psychopharmacology has to offer at this time, 2015, in preventing patients from having another relapse into major depression. So all the billions of dollars of research spent into developing these drugs may be leading us down the wrong alley, and other techniques may be as effective as the intervention with psychopharmacological agents. Now, we need another piece to understand the paper that we will be discussing. Now, this is the linkage of craving, addiction, and the dopamine system in the brain. Dopamine is a very interesting molecule. It has cell bodies originating in the midbrain, ancient evolutionary structures that were there well before the cortex, the massive expansion of the neocortex, had taken place in mammals, in primates, and in particular in humans. Without dopamine, nothing much would happen in your life. Dopamine powers locomotion. If you don't have enough dopamine in the substantia nigra, you develop rigidity, you have difficulty initiating movements, you have Parkinson's disease. If you have a decrease of dopamine in the midbrain areas called the ventral tegmentum, you develop depressive symptoms. Again, you don't want to get out of bed, you're not interested in things, you're not engaging with the world. So dopamine is a driver of both motoric as well as motivational sources of interacting with the world. It makes you get out and do stuff in the world. Now, the way it does it is it issues a reward signal. When you get out and you do something, it's experienced as rewarding. It also rewards food. It is important in evolutionary terms that you eat on a regular basis, else you will die and you will not give your genes a chance to get into the next generation. Likewise, you need to find a partner and you need to make babies. So sex and the sexual drive critically involves dopamine as well. You need to consider that evolution did not create your nervous system in order to make you wise and happy. Its only goal, so to speak, is to transmit genes into the next generation. It doesn't much care about how you feel about it. That is the goal. That is the success story. If your genes get transmitted, evolution declares success and moves on to tinker some more and perhaps edit this or that and maybe increase efficiency even further. Now, as it turns out, you can hijack the dopamine system. You don't have to go out in the world and accomplish things. You just ingest a drug. And there are, of course, a number of drugs, such as cocaine and amphetamine, which directly release dopamine in various ways and yield this incredible effect of reward and the repetition compulsion of re-administering the drug on a regular basis. But then we have a drug called nicotine. Now, nicotine works on the nicotine receptor, of which there are two outlined here, and in some way, eventually, the activation of these nicotine receptors also talk to the dopamine system in the ventral tegmental area, triggering the experience of reward. Likewise, opiates eventually work down the similar pathway. All roads lead to Rome. All drugs of abuse lead to dopamine and dopamine reinforcement. So that is the basis of craving. The Buddha talked about craving a great deal. There's a Pali word called tanha, meaning craving or literally thirst. The need to drink something or the need to have something is a very powerful source, and the Buddha identified craving as one of the primary movers of unhappiness. Now, why would that be? It is because once you have received your dopamine stimulus, either from a drug or a piece of work that you accomplished, a round of applause after a performance, the system attenuates and the effect dies down, and you're left just like you were before. In other words, you need to create a repeat performance. You are now running on what's called the hedonic treadmill. And as long as you shall live, you will not get off this treadmill, because you are now engaged in the world in such a way that craving and the experience of reward are with you every single day. The Buddha suggests that to the extent that you can attenuate craving, you can liberate yourself from the hedonic treadmill and avoid a great deal of suffering and unhappiness that often results by running on this hedonic treadmill, like a gerbil or a mouse that has been trained to do so for a reward. So here then are various drugs of abuse: amphetamines, cocaine, we have nicotine that we will focus on later, and ethanol, as well as opiates and sedatives. All of these come to a final common pathway of enhancing dopamine transmission, in other words, tapping into the reward system. This is a very powerful system that sits deep in the brain, and it's created by evolution for very powerful purposes, namely to make you go, to have you engaged in life, and to procreate and get your genes into the next generation. And it doesn't get more basic and more fundamental than that. And what the Buddha then says is this machinery is the one, this very machinery is the one that tends to create suffering. In other words, the preconditions for life, getting out, being successful, being active in the world, getting reward, having sex, eating a good meal, all these things have an underlying problem, namely, the satisfying, the rewarding effect is fleeting. It will attenuate and rapidly vanish, and then you have to do it all over again. That makes a lot of sense, because if you had sex only one time and then you were in eternal bliss and satisfied for the rest of your life, you would certainly minimize your chances to get your genes into the next generation, and that's all evolution cares about. So evolution has, quote unquote, designed the reward system in such a way that it will always frustrate you. It will hook you, and then it will frustrate you because it wants you to get up and do it again. That is the evolutionary agenda. It may not be your agenda, but that's what you come with. And the Buddha somehow intuited these connections and identified them and suggested a pathway to loosening the linkage in your mind to reward and craving in order to liberate you for a different kind of happiness. So here then is the original protocol that was designed to use mindfulness to enhance smoking cessation. Now, nicotine happens to be one of the most addicting compounds known to man. If you ever were a smoker, or you are a smoker, or you know a smoker, and you have listened to the stories of attempted quitting, you know the terrific hold that nicotine has on the dopamine system and on the smoker. And smoking, of course, is a huge public health problem, motivating these kinds of studies. How can we find a way to alleviate the hedonic treadmill introduced by nicotine in those who are susceptible to this effect, which is almost everybody. So the idea that was proposed is to use mindfulness. Mindfulness can be described as an awareness of moment-to-moment experiences arising from attention that is characterized by a curiosity and acceptance of these present moment-to-moment experiences. Importantly, mindfulness can be directed towards wanting and craving. Now that's a revolutionary idea because nobody wants to experience craving. You want to extinguish craving by administering the next dose of drug or smoke the next cigarette. So the idea here is following the Buddha's suggestion that by paying attention to the craving, staying with it, analyzing the feelings that it evokes in the body and the sensation in the mind, the emotional components of craving, paying attention to all of these items of craving is predicted to loosen the link between craving and continued smoking behavior. That is the theory. So craving then is a hallmark of the addictive process. And by learning to non-judgmentally observe the craving through mindfulness techniques, one might be able to decouple the associative link between craving and subsequent behavior. So the person who put this smoking study on the map is Judson Brewer, who was at Yale, and while at Yale he published an original paper on the impact that many years of meditations have on the brain of very experienced meditators that were flown in to his lab. This paper was published in 2011, and it was really a tremendous advance in showing that mindfulness meditation has powerful effects on brain connectivity. So the same Judson Brewer now is directing his attention to addictive processes. So here is then a conceptualization of how this works. We have cues in the environment, positive cues and negative cues. If you ask a smoker, what makes you light up? You'll say, wow, I had a great experience and I was successful. My paper got published and wow, I celebrated by having a smoke. Or I came to the lab, my boss was yelling at me, I fell down and I had a smoke. So both positive and negative affects can be associated with the smoking behavior and trigger craving, which then results in smoking. The same is true for eating. Overeating, using food as a way to calm your mind down and to deal with negative affect is also very well established. And here's sort of a combination of the reinforcement theory of craving and some Buddhist ideas. Namely, we have pleasant or unpleasant affects, craving is triggered, and in the old formulation of the Buddhist theory, the craving triggers behavior which leads to an increased self-identity, in other words, a rebirth of yourself and even the generation of a strong feeling of self. Now, we will not get into the woods about these items and rather follow Stephen Batchelor, who has taken these ideas of reincarnation and rebirth out of the equation, and we will deal in a separate lecture with his way of presenting the Dharma without the religious overlay. So here then was the first paper, Mindfulness Training for Smoking Cessation, Moderation of the Relationship Between Craving and Cigarette Use. And here's the model again. You can see that smoking becomes associated with different affects, and cues lead to these kinds of smoking behaviors. Cues are so manifold that you can't possibly all trace them down. So where do we start our intervention? Avoidance of cues is a dead end because the cues are just everywhere and uncountable. So perhaps something else could be proposed, namely what he calls substitute behaviors. Perhaps the craving and smoking cascade can be interrupted by doing something different. And this difference is paying mindful attention to the sensations and experiences of craving itself. So the folks in the study were trained to use mindfulness, namely to recognize craving, accept it, and investigate it, and then make a note of it. Oh, craving, pretty strong. Even put a number, a rating scale on the intensity of craving, and create a so-called want-o-meter. How strong did I want the cigarette? How strong was the craving? They're directed to identify their smoking trigger, rate their cravings, and choose between using this RAIN acronym procedure to write out their cravings or completing an audio-guided exercise to smoke mindfully. Now this is really a paradox. Light up the cigarette and pay close attention to the sensations, physical sensations, and mental effects of smoking itself. Many smokers would say, when I pay mindful attention to smoking, I notice that the stuff really tastes nasty, and it has a strange odor to it, and my lungs kind of feel horrible after I smoke a cigarette. So paying mindful attention to the administration of the drug, to the behavior itself, can alter the perception of the reinforcing power of the drug. And we live in the age of iPhones, of course, and now this can be put into an app. So whenever you have a craving, you can call up your app. You use the RAIN recognizing, paying attention, investigating, and noting sequence in the app, and you can enter your experiences and data into the app, and you are connected to a community of other quitters who go through this at the same time. Community strengthening the resolve of folks to stay abstinent. And here's the finding, which is quite astonishing. It was a fairly small number of patients who were enrolled, but you can see that when you don't do anything and just have the patient do his regular behavior, there is a strong correlation between craving and subsequent smoking. But we all know this. You want something, you have a craving for something, you eat the cookie, the craving and the cookie are directly correlated. And the correlation is very strong. The N is small, only 32 folks. It's amazing that a strong correlation was found at all. But the correlation was highly statistically significant. Now, those folks that used the mindfulness intervention, and those folks, the correlation between craving and subsequent smoking was destroyed. So that causal link from craving to smoking was no longer causally that effective. Now that's an amazing thing. How does it compare to other treatments? Well, here are some other ways of treating nicotine dependence and smoking behavior. And as it turns out, the mindfulness training procedure was several times more effective than other standard techniques in assisting patients to quit smoking. That is an amazing finding. So we have now confirmed the Buddha's prediction that by paying close attention to craving and not running from it or indulging in it immediately, you can alleviate suffering, you can decrease the painful effects of the craving on your own mind. So his hypothesis then has been confirmed, at least in this particular paradigm. So here is another outline of the procedure. You can see there's a training to quit app that you can download. And here are the different days that you're involved in the procedure. You have a 21-day training period. You have daily modules with animations which capture your attention. And you have exercises that you can perform right then and there. So you can incorporate experience sampling. You can call up in the app, and the operators will know that you are right now in Boston, you're on First Street, you have an intense craving, and here's what you're doing about it. You can be tracked in real time as to how you're handling the craving, and you can receive feedback and encouragement. So let's go briefly to a brain area that seems to be critically involved in this craving and in the meditative or the mindfulness experience, namely the posterior cingulate gyrus here. It's part of the so-called default mode network, that network of the brain that works overtime when you're doing nothing and just following your own thoughts, your idle thoughts, and you're not involved in any particular task that requires you to focus your attention on something outside yourself. The default mode network is in midline areas, cingulate cortex, anterior frontal cortex, and the posterior cingulate cortex. Now, Dr. Brewer has homed in on this posterior cingulate cortex and has developed methods by which you can assess the intensity of your meditative experience by in vivo following the activity or the connectedness of the posterior cingulate gyrus. So studies are converging on this particular brain area, and the theory now is that the getting caught up in an experience, for example, such as craving, is in some way related to the activity of this particular aspect of the default mode network, the posterior cingulate gyrus. So the task then of mindfulness training would be to not get caught up in yourself, but rather focus on the breath, some other ideas, but not your internal dialogue, your internal preoccupation, or your internal cravings. This is a flashback to the original study in PNAS that Dr. Brewer came up with. Here you see the iconic signal in the posterior cingulate gyrus decrease in activity and connectivity in this area in very experienced meditators. And here it is again. So can we use feedback? Can we tap into the function of the posterior cingulate gyrus during the meditative experience? And yes, we can. So this is real-time neurofeedback. We have discussed this earlier in a presentation on mindfulness meditation, but it's worth reviewing this again because this will certainly come up again in the treatment of addictive disease. So here we have a novice meditator who is trying to meditate on the breath, let's say, and you can see that activity is high. He is able to bring down the activity of the posterior cingulate gyrus by basically looking at a screen and trying to optimize how much blue he can generate by adjusting what he does inside his mind, focusing on the breath, for example. And you can now have a neurophenomenology. What happens in the mind when either the depth of meditation is increased or decreased? And you can get experience sampling, so to speak. The meditator can tell you, well, I was really in a very good meditative state, and then suddenly I was thinking, wow, I'm doing really good. And maybe this procedure is really working, and bam, you pop right out of the meditative experience because you're now involved in a self-reflected, self-involved activity which will immediately destroy the meditative depth. And you can see here, experienced meditators keep things nicely blue, and this can be done by both jhana meditation, which is basically attention, focus meditation, staying with one item for an extended period of time, or by loving kindness meditation by thinking of folks close to you or people in the community at large and sending them wishes internally of being well, being free of suffering, and loving kindness. And as you focus on those thoughts, you can also generate a meditative experience. It's very interesting that these two types of meditations converge on the same brain signal, indicating that there is a commonality between various meditation techniques with regard to decreasing the activity of the default mode network. Okay, so let's summarize. What we have attempted to do is take a pronouncement of the Buddha made 2,500 years ago, which could be stated as a prediction. Namely, if you focus your attention in a meditative, attentive way on an item of suffering such as pain or craving, it is likely that the impact of this experience will decrease. And this notion then was picked up by Dr. Brewer in the craving study in smokers, and lo and behold, attentive mindfulness to the various aspects of craving and smoking, in fact, leads to a powerful enhancement of the anti-smoking effect, which of course has significant prognostic implications for smoking cessation in larger populations. Okay, so this was the first of our talks in which we will try to link the ancient Dharma that the Buddha came up with emerging aspects of neuroscience, which by and large seem to confirm the intuitive predictions that he has made 2,500 years ago. Thank you much for your attention, and we'll see you soon again at Behavioral Health 2000.